Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Danny and today I wanted to celebrate and recap my completion of the Fantasy Subreddit's Bingo Book Challenge for 2024. I want to briefly talk through each of the prompts and the books I chose for each one. And if you're not already familiar with what this challenge is, it's an annual challenge released by the R Fantasy subreddit. The bingo board and prompts are released on April 1st and the challenge runs through March 31st of the following year. So if you want to join next year, the new board will be released on April 1st. This is more of a personal challenge for me. I'm not very active on Reddit, but the goal of this challenge is to branch out your reading, and I like using it for that purpose. Some of these prompts I completed fairly incidentally without needing to think about it too much, but others I did need to go out of my comfort zone and do some research and put in some effort to read a book that would fit the prompt. Because the goal is to expand your reading, there are some parameters of the challenge, like you can't use the same book more than once on the card, you can't repeat an author on the card, and only one square can be a reread. As I was going through my notes to put together this video, I realized that I do in fact have a repeat author on my bingo card. It's Samantha Shannon with the Roots of Chaos series. I will be able to repair this before the official end date of the challenge with a book I'm planning to read next month, but I'll just mention that when I get to it. Okay, as I dive in, each of the prompts has a hard mode version. I was not trying to hit hard mode on any of these with my selections, but I will let you know if I did incidentally hit hard mode with my choice. The first prompt is to read the first book in a series, and you hit hard mode if the series is more than 3 books long. I chose The Air Affair by Jasper Fforde for this one, and it does meet the hard mode criteria. This is a book and a series that takes place in an alternate reality where the Crimean War has been going on for more than a century, and classic literature is like widely beloved and debated, and time travel is possible. And our heroine in this Thursday Next is a literary detective who is tracking down a villain who's kidnapping characters from classic novels, including Jane Eyre. I thought this was worth reading just for how creative it was with the world building. It was truly like the author had a fishbowl full of like world building prompts, and instead of choosing 1 or 2, he just went with the entire fishbowl. It was unhinged in a really interesting, entertaining way. That said, I don't think I'm going to continue with this series. I just didn't find the characters compelling enough, but I would recommend it if someone was interested in this goofy kind of story. The next prompt is an alliterative title. Read a book where multiple words in the title begin with the same letter. And hard mode was to read a title that has 3 words or more that start with the same letter. So I did hit hard mode with The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. I really loved this read. Locke Lamora is a master thief in this gritty Venetian fantasy world, fantasy city of Camorr. And there's heists, there's political conspiracies, there's found family, all things that I love. The next prompt was Under the Surface. Read a book where an important setting is either underground or underwater. And hard mode was that at least half the book takes place underground or underwater. And I hit hard mode with The Deep by Rivers Solomon. This is a novella that has mermaids that are descendants of pregnant African slaves thrown overboard during the Middle Passage, and the painful memories of that history are all held by one keeper of the memories in a sort of giver type premise. This novella didn't totally work for me in its execution, but I'm really glad that I read it, and I thought the premise offered an interesting perspective on generational trauma and the conflict of individualism versus collectivism. The next prompt here is criminals read a book in which the main character is a criminal, and hard mode is that it features a heist. For this one, I read The Secret Lives of Country Gentlemen by KJ Charles. This one isn't sci-fi or fantasy, but it's genre fiction, so for my purposes, I counted it. This is a queer Regency romance that takes place. The romance is between a newly promoted baronet and a man who is connected to a thriving smuggling business during the war with France. So I thought this was a really cute romance, and I'm glad to have read it. Next is Dreams. Read a book where characters experience dreams, magical or otherwise. And hard mode is the dream is not mystical or unusual, it's just a normal dream or nightmare. So I did not hit hard mode here. I chose A Day of Fallen Night by Samantha Shannon. This is a prequel to The Priory of the Orange Tree, but either of these books could be read as a standalone, and it's a multi-point of view story, but two of the main characters in this book have a connection through dreams, even though they've never met one another and they live on different continents. The next prompt is entitled Animals. Read a book that has an animal in the title, and the animal in the title does not have to appear in the story. Hard mode was the animal in the title is a fantasy or sci-fi creature. So I read The Kaiju Preservation Society by John Scalzi. This was my first John Scalzi book, and it was a fun popcorn read. So in this, the main character gets recruited to protect kaiju living in an alternate dimension, and it was a fun, blockbuster movie type read. The next prompt is Bards. Read a book in which the primary protagonist is a bard, musician, poet, or storyteller, and hard mode is that the character is explicitly called a bard. For this, I read The Black-Tongued Thief by Christopher Buehlman. In this, the main character is ostensibly a thief. I don't think he's ever called a bard, but he is telling the story in the first person, like he's sitting with you at the bar, and the narrative voice of this story was so fun and interesting. The protagonist also carries around a fiddle and plays music several times, so I read him as a bard. The next prompt is prologues and epilogues. Read a book that has either a prologue or an epilogue, and hard mode is that it must have both. I cannot remember if this had an epilogue, but my guess is that it didn't, because it's part of a series and it ends on a cliffhanger. That's what I remember about it. This Dark Rise by C.S. Pacat is a YA series that uses classic tropes of good and evil, and the trope of the chosen one in this reincarnation story. So the heroes and villains on each side of this ancient conflict are being reborn, and the descendants of families associated on each side are preparing for this conflict to come again. I really enjoyed this book, and even more so when we get into the second book, as there's more ambiguity and reversals around those tropes. The next prompt is self-published or indie publisher, and it's like it sounds. Hard mode was that it's self-published and has fewer than 100 ratings on Goodreads, or it's an indie publisher that has done an AMA on the fantasy subreddit. This does not meet hard mode, but I chose The Gilda Stories by Joel Gomez. This was published in 1991 by Firebrand Books, a publishing house that was established in Ithaca, New York, and moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan. I am also originally from the Ithaca, New York area, and I moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan for graduate school, so I thought that was a neat connection. I thought The Gilda Stories was a genre classic worth reading. It follows a Black lesbian vampire from the time that she escaped from slavery in 1850s Louisiana up through beyond the present day, going into speculative fiction future territory. The next prompt is romantasy. Read a book that features romance as a main plot. Hard mode is that the main character is LGBTQIA+. And I read Feybound for this by Sara El-Arifi. I picked this up on the recommendation that it'd be good for people who are not usually romantasy enjoyers. I think because this leans a little bit more towards fantasy than the romance, but I still didn't love it. I felt it read very YA, even though the characters were all in their 20s and 30s, and it didn't really execute on either the fantasy or the romance plot. I think this is just my problem with romantasy in general, is I would rather see one or the other done more focused. The next prompt is dark academia. Read a book that fits the dark academia aesthetic. This includes school and university, secret societies, and dark secrets. And hard mode is that the school itself is entirely mundane. For this, I read An Academy for Liars by Alexis Henderson. This is a book in which the main character gets a mysterious call to take an entrance exam for this university that ends up being a university of magic users. And it is definitely dark academia. There is a lot of spooky stuff, and I thought the horror elements of the writing were really well done, but overall the book as a whole felt really rushed to me. The next prompt is multi-POV. Read a book with at least 3 point of view characters, and hard mode is that it has at least 5 point of view characters. For this, I read Long Live Evil by Sarah Rees Brennan. This is a portal fantasy about a dying girl who gets a chance to live and adventure out in her favorite fantasy romance series. What she doesn't realize when she strikes this bargain is that she will be transplanted into the role of the main villainess of the story the day before she's executed. I thought this was a fun take on the isekai genre, and I can't remember anymore if it meets the criteria for hard mode. I know there were a lot of POV characters, I just don't remember how many exactly, but I recommend it. The next prompt was published in 2024, and hard mode was that it's also the author's first published novel. The book I chose is Womb City by Tlotlo Tsamase. This was the author's first novel, but she also already wrote short stories and poetry before she published this book last year. This is a dystopian horror sci-fi set in a future Botswana with body hopping and Minority Report type criminal surveillance, and it also had vengeful ghosts. Unfortunately for me, it felt like it was just too much happening in one story, but the sentence level writing was really great, and I'd still be curious to read some of her short stories. The next prompt is character with a disability. Read a book in which an important character has a physical or mental disability, and hard mode was that it's the main character that has the disability. For this, I read The Bright Sword by Lev Grossman. This is an Arthurian legend retelling, and one of the central characters, though I wouldn't call him the main character, is Sir Bedivere, who is a one-handed warrior. Next prompt is published in the 1990s, and hard mode is that the author or one of the authors has also published something in the last 5 years. For this, I read Reaper Man by Terry Pratchett. I am working my way through the Discworld series. In this Discworld novel, Death gets fired, and the people of the Discworld, both living and dead, have to deal with the consequences of that. I think now the topic of public services like this getting suddenly dismantled is unfortunately timely. The next prompt is Orcs, Trolls, and Goblins, oh my, and the prompt is to read a book featuring orcs, trolls, or goblins. And hard mode is that the orc, troll, or goblin is a main character. For this, I read Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. In this, if you don't already know the plot, it's an orc retires from adventuring and opens a cafe. This wasn't groundbreaking or anything, but it was exactly what I expected and wanted it to be for a cozy little cafe story. The next prompt is space opera. Read a sci-fi book that features a large cast of characters and has a focus on social dynamics, which may be political or personal in nature, set primarily in space or on spaceships. Hard mode was to read a story written by an author of a marginalized gender identity. So a woman, a trans person, or a non-binary person. For this, I read The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin. I'll be honest, even after reading the prompt, I still don't feel like I really understand what counts as a space opera, and I don't know if The Dispossessed is a space opera. I guess my concern is that it's not high drama enough to be considered a space opera, but it is set in space, and it involves social dynamics of both political and personal nature, so I counted it. And it was one of the best books I read last year, so yay. The next prompt is author of color. Read a book by an author of color, and hard mode is that it must be a debut novel published in the last 5 years. This doesn't meet hard mode, but I read Chain Gang All-Stars by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. This is a story where prisoners compete in gladiator-style death matches for a slim chance at freedom. If they survive for 3 years in this system, then they can be free. This was a really powerful book about the prison industrial system and our relationship with reality TV and exploitation for entertainment. The next prompt is survival. Read a book in which the primary goal of the characters and story focuses on survival. And hard mode is that it can't have any superviruses or pandemics. For this, I read The Last Murder at the End of the World by Stuart Turton. This is a mystery that's set in the backdrop of a post-apocalyptic world. It takes place on an island that is the last refuge in the whole world against a world that's been decimated by a deadly fog. So this island housed a scientific research center that was able to create a dome to keep the fog at bay. And then when one of the scientists on the island is murdered, the islanders need to solve the mystery in 107 hours or the dome will fail. The next prompt is judge a book by its cover. Choose a book because you like its cover. And then hard mode is that you can pick the book based only on the information available on the cover, no reading the blurb. I didn't do that for this one. I saw a review before I picked it, but I loved the cover of A Botanical Daughter by Noah Medlock. This is a sci-fi horror book in the tradition of Frankenstein, wherein a pair of Victorian gentlemen, a taxidermist and a botanist, create a botanical daughter using an intelligent fungus and a recently deceased corpse. There's obviously an exploration of ambition and familial conflict here, but what really surprised me was how funny this book was. The characters, the gay dads, are really curmudgeonly, and that was fun. The next prompt is set in a small town. The primary setting is a small town, and hard mode was that the small town can be real or fictional, but the broader setting must be our real world and not a secondary world. For this, I read Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett. This is set in the fictional town of Ravensvik, which is in Norway, I think, or maybe it's just in like vague northern Scandinavia. But the broader setting is our real world because Emily Wilde is a professor at Cambridge University studying fairies. The next prompt was to read 5 sci-fi fantasy short stories, any 5 short stories or novelettes, and hard mode was to read an entire speculative anthology or collection. I ended up reading the collection of short stories by Sofia Samatar titled Tender. I am really glad that the bingo board pushed me to read a short story collection because I loved this. So many of the short stories in this collection are responses to or recontextualizations of folk stories or other historical texts. And I think maybe her most famous short story, or the one that really put her on the map, is called Selkie Stories Are for Lovers. That one was wonderful in the vein of rethinking about traditional folk tales in new ways. Other themes in the collection were colonialism and environmental collapse and familial relationships in general. The next prompt is Eldritch Creatures. Read a book featuring a being that is uncanny, unearthly, and weird. This can be a god or monster from another plane or realm and is usually beyond mortal understanding. Hard mode is that the book is not related to the Cthulhu mythos. For this, I read Bunny by Mona Awad. This is a surrealist novel about a social misfit in an MFA program. And a lot of the surrealist stuff in the book you can read entirely metaphorically, or you can read it in a more literal and horrific sense. The main character, Samantha, ends up getting invited to these weekly meetings with her MFA cohort in which they are doing this ritual that turns rabbits into men, which they call their drafts. And I put this in Eldritch because these creatures, these bunny men, are very uncanny and unexplainable and unexplained. They lack human hands. They have no sense of self-awareness. But it was such an intriguing and creepy book that you can interpret many different ways. The next prompt was reference materials. Read a book that features additional materials such as a map, footnotes, glossary, translation guide, dramatis personae, etc. And hard mode was that the book contains at least 2 types of additional materials. So I had chosen The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon for this. That book does contain a map and a cast of characters, but like I said, I realized I already used Samantha Shannon on this list for A Day of Fallen Night for the Dreams prompt. I think before the challenge officially ends, I will be reading Circe by Madeline Miller, and I can substitute that in this square. Circe has a cast of characters in it, so that'll work. The final prompt is to read a book club or read-along book. So the fantasy subreddit has book clubs and read-alongs, and the hard mode is to read a current selection of either a book club or read-along and participate in the discussion. I didn't do hard mode on this one, but I did choose This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Mokhtar and Max Gladstone. This one was historically a book club pick on the subreddit, and I think it would be really fun to discuss as a book club. It's a pretty dense little book, and I think it would be really fun to discuss. That is it for wrapping up my 2024 Art Fantasy Book Bingo. Please let me know your thoughts on any of the books on my bingo board, or let me know your thoughts on the challenge in general. Is this something you've done yourself? Would you be interested in doing it? Thanks so much for watching, and until next time.